Now, let's turn to this session. And it has a very, very important title. Where is the money? The next 15 years is being decided in the next few months. We have, in the field of education currently, one goal, SDG 4. It is incredibly ambitious. It will cost a lot, and it will be difficult to measure. If we compare this to the last 15 years, MDGs and the EFA goals, I think it is fair to say that the results after the last 15 years, even though we didn't manage to reach the target of the finance, did not give the results that we wanted. But MDG 2, as you know, was about enrollment. It was fairly simple to measure. However, it did not give the results of making sure that quality was a reality for all of those children who pass through the system. So we have to be conscious about mobilizing more funding, but making sure that the quality is delivered. The challenge is then very much not only to mobilize more funding, it is to make sure that we can deliver better. What is important is that learning takes place, not to count numbers of children enrolled in the system. We have to make sure that we can make better use of limited resources. I think it is not likely that we will identify all the money indicated. Actually, the latest figures is slightly different to the $26 billion gap that you saw in the papers. We have last week new indications. The gap is $22 billion for the next 15 years on the core part of education delivery, meaning early childhood, primary, and lower secondary. That's a tall number. We know that the government will already, they pay most of the bill. They will probably continue to have to pay most of the bill. The donors will have to mobilize far more in order to reach that target. And we are here also obviously to see how other partners like the private sector can contribute in an important way. But I think it is clear that we need to see how we can make better use of limited resources. We also saw this morning some excellent examples of how important it is and what a good investment it is to make sure that education systems deliver good quality. We also saw that it makes sense from an investment point of view to make sure that education is equitable, which is another tall challenge for all of us to make sure that we can deliver on. Now, I'm looking forward to this discussion. We have with us a series of panelists covering very important parts of the education system, and I will now meanwhile take my seat right over there. And if this microphone works, it does, we will then first start our presentation of the panelists. We have then a discussion among the panelists, and we will then afterwards be very happy to have your questions from the floor. I would like to start with Ms. Rebecca Winthrop, who is the Director and Senior Fellow of Center for Universal Education at Brookings, United States. It's a very well-known think tank covering a lot of research and studies in a whole range of different areas. So what are your thoughts on some of these important questions we would like to find answers to on this session? Please.
Thank you so much, Svein. It's a question that we're obsessed about at the moment in my team at the Brookings Institution because we've been doing for some years work on this very issue of closing the financing gap. And I have great colleagues, Lisbeth Steer and Emily Gustafsson Wright in particular, who are leading that work. And we're very interested in looking at all possible angles, whether it's looking at government budgets, and I look at you, Minister. I think there's a lot of room for being more equitable and more efficient in how we allocate and use government budgets, so using current budgets better, looking at donors, and I know Norman will talk from a donor angle. One area we're also actively looking at in terms of does it have potential is the idea of impact investing, social impact investing. And there's not a lot of data. This is a relatively new field. Luckily, we have two colleagues on the panel who actually do it, I think, or at least your companies do. On the ground, so I'm sure they can provide insight. But in terms of the big picture, in terms of closing the financing gap, it's not a ton of money from impact investing. And for those who don't know, impact investing or social finance, it's this idea, you have charities and philanthropies on the one hand who give money, not expecting a return on money, they give money, and then you have businesses who make investments because they want a return on their investment. This is something in the middle where you have investors who invest but willing to make a little less return on their investment because they get some social good impact out of it. And the best information we have is that roughly in education, from all types of impact investing, it's about $1 billion a year at the moment, more or less. One particular type of impact investing is social impact bonds. Sometimes people call them development impact bonds. Social impact bonds, again, for those who might not be steeped in this, are where you have an investor, so somebody investing money, and you usually have an intermediary, who is delivering a government service, and then when they get the outcomes agreed upon, the government pays the investor back. There is an idea out there, and it has not yet actually in real life been tried, to do social impact bonds in developing countries where you would not have the government pay back the investor, but a donor pay back the investor. So what do we know about social impact bonds? My colleague Emily, as I mentioned before, is together with, has a wonderful task force who's looking at this and the possible merits of social impact bonds for education, and is tracking every single possible social impact bond that is happening right now, no matter what the sector, and the deals that are being discussed at the moment. And currently there's 39 social impact bonds in the world that are live, up and running. 2 are in early childhood, and in fact Goldman Sachs, Chicago and Utah is engaged in that. 12 are in youth employment, so bridging the skills to work piece. Every single one of them are in a developed country. There's not a single one yet that's up and running that's in a developing country. The large majority are in the UK, then the US, some European countries. There are about 14 or more, they're cropping up every day, of social impact bonds under discussion, but they haven't actually started yet. There's one being discussed in India for girls' education that's almost hopefully going to come live, and things like that. But I think what we have to ask ourselves in terms of closing the financing gap is, will social impact bonds be useful in poor countries, in low-income countries and developing countries? Big question, not yet determined. It looks like impact investing writ large, various mechanisms, including social impact bonds, are most likely appealing, and we should ask our private sector colleagues, in middle-income countries where there's more of a market. So that's a question in my mind. Another question is, are they going to be able to be useful and interesting, or be attractive really, for basic education because of the time lag and the problem around metrics and measuring outcomes. Clearly the youth the sort of skills to work piece is appealing because you can have outcomes in a short period of time. So that's another real question. And then a question for me also, or for us, I would say, is what really is the potential for scale for social impact bonds? The other thing to note, most of the existing social impact bonds are quite small. Half of the 39 that exist today are less than $10 million. And then some of them are quite small. And they're complicated to put together. Maybe they have potential to scale if people really get fluid with making the deals, and or if there's a possibility of coming up with sort of funds that individuals can invest in, or say the corpus of foundations can invest in that are around, that have sort of our social impact funds that others could invest in. So those are some of the questions on the table.
Thank you very much to you, Rebecca. So we understand that private sector's contribution is relatively limited for the time being. There are very high expectations concerning the role of private sector in financing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals currently on the table. We don't know the total cost. Only in education is enormous, but you can imagine if you add the 16 other Sustainable Development Goals, the price on this will be impossible for governments to fund themselves. So I think there's a lot of very high expectations from private sector as to what kind of role they can play in the future to cover at least a part of that gap. But we then understand there's a long way to go before we are in such a position. Now, the next panelist is Mr. Norman LaRocque, who is Principal Education Specialist, Asian Development Bank. You are then representing the donor community. According to Global Monitoring Report's latest calculations, they think that in order for this gap to be met, donors will have to increase 4 times their contribution to education. Now, is that likely to happen?
Yeah. Well, who knows? But certainly the gaps are large. We've heard just of in education, but in Southeast Asia, there's billions and billions of dollars of gaps in infrastructure as well. So there's a lot of competition for money. At ADB, we do loans, we do technical assistance, we do loan guarantees to help to get more private sector involvement. We have both a public sector arm that finances through governments, sometimes financing in a way that brings the private sector in, increasingly I would say. We also have a private sector operations department, which is still at a very nascent stage in terms of education and health lending. Now, as you said, the money can either come from governments or taxpayers, it can come from firms, it can come from individuals, or it can come from donors. The environment for getting additional donor money at this stage is fairly tight. One need only look at the Australian government, which is significantly cutting back on its aid money, official development assistance money now, because of financial problems and budget problems back home. We've just seen a number of major programs cut back in Indonesia. One loan in the Philippines or a grant in the Philippines was cut from 300 to 150 million just in the last year and a bit. So there's a lot of pressure on, not a lot of money out there. At ADB, we find a lot of pressure to get technical assistance money, which you need, because often if you want to prepare a loan and do anything really innovative, you actually have to have enough money to prepare it. We also are facing other challenges. One is just dealing with lower middle income countries. Before, it was easier in the sense you were dealing with countries that were relatively poor, relatively unsophisticated in terms of the kind of components or designs that they wanted in loans. It's very easy to build a number of small schoolhouses. When you start to look at much bigger PPP arrangements, infrastructure PPP arrangements, it's a lot more difficult. It requires a lot more capacity. Also, what's been happening with the developing member countries for ADB is that many more have been moving up the income levels. So many do not qualify now for grants. I think we only have 1 or 2 countries now who get outright grants from the ADB. Everyone else either borrows ADF, which is our cheap money, or OCR, which is our market-based money. And many governments, some governments have explicit requirements that if they lend money through OCR, if they borrow money through OCR, they have to on-lend it to an entity. As a result, they generally only want to borrow this expensive money for things like infrastructure, where they can charge, a toll road, where it will be self-financing. To ask them to borrow and then expect a university of 5,000 students to repay a $200 million loan, which is one of the loans that I have right now, is impossible. And in that case, we were able to get the government to waive the requirement that it be on lent. But that is a major issue for us, as well as just the fact that it's seen as social. Why do we want to borrow for this? In many cases, governments are putting their own money into education. The case of Indonesia, where they have a constitutional requirement that says 20% of their budget has to go into education. The money may be there. That doesn't necessarily mean it's being well spent. And I think this is one of the areas where donors can play a role in helping to improve the design and implementation. We're focusing much more on higher education and technical and vocational education. If you look at the shift in the allocation of our money across subsectors, it's really quite remarkable to see how much we have moved towards higher education and skills development broadly defined. ADB, for a number of years now, since 2008, education has been one of its core sectors, one of 5. Despite that, we're only at 3% of our lending was going into education, very small amount. Under a recent midterm review of our Strategy 2020, we've raised that target to 6 to 10%. I think for 2014, we managed to reach 6% already, but the year before we were at 3. So that is another. We are putting more emphasis on education financing, but because of some of these other constraints, it can be a bit difficult at times, particularly if you're getting lower middle income countries who no longer want to borrow in the social sectors. So we have to be more clever. We have to think about how we can leverage, how we can do innovative things like PPPs. I'll just briefly introduce at one stage during the questioning, I'll be talking about a loan, a $300 million loan that we processed that was approved just in December, that I processed at ADB for senior high school in the Philippines. We put $300 million in that. The government's contribution to that was 4.1 billion. So with just 6.8% of the funding, we were able to get a number. It's a results-based loan, so they actually have to achieve things to get the money. They don't just get it by building another classroom. They actually have to achieve certain things. By just putting in 6.8% of the money, we've been able to get them to sign up to a number of these result-based indicators that should make for a much better implemented project than under one of our old sort of project-style loans. So that's all I will say, and we'll talk more later.
Thank you very much to you, Norman. Now, we come to the private sector, and we have high expectations from you and some of the good ideas you can bring here today. First, we'll start with Mr. Victor who is the Global Head of Education, Technology and Services in Goldman Sachs in the US. So if you, Victor, could tell us a little bit of where private sector currently is investing and what are some of the things we can see in the future from the private sector.
Sure, thank you. And let me start by thanking our hosts, GEMS and the Varkey Foundation, Sunny and Vikas and others for organizing and hosting a really remarkable forum for this conversation. As you said, and by way of introduction, my name is Victor Hu, and I'm based in San Francisco. I lead Goldman Sachs' global education team. And we seek to advise, finance, and invest in the leading education companies globally. And so let me just in this introduction briefly sort of make 3 remarks. The first is that, from our vantage point, private sector involvement in the education space is absolutely growing and is actually growing at a reasonably fast pace. Sitting in Silicon Valley, one of the interesting things about it is our daily or weekly interactions with the investors on Sand Hill Road, the venture capitalists who many regard as living in a bit of a bubble or a cocoon of their own in Silicon Valley, but at the same time have invested in some of the leading businesses that are known globally and really are the tip of the spear as it relates to investment in innovation and dislocation and change. And one of the interesting things that we've noticed from our own data is that the venture capital and growth investment in private sector education has grown very remarkably. Over the decade leading up to 2012, the investment in this space was very small as a percentage of total venture capital dollars. Sub 3%. It averaged probably around $250 to $300 million a year. Since that time, it really has been an explosion. In 2012, it crossed $1 billion. In 2013, 1.3. Last year, it was at $1.8 billion. And so we think that we've reached this new plane of investment where investors up and down Sand Hill Road, and frankly all around the United States and around the world, our dialogue with investors is really at a global level, have perceived this space to be a more investable category than it ever has been before. And I think there are a number of reasons for that, which we can go into. But to put it simply, the macro environment obviously has been conducive, lower interest rates, general sort of cyclical growth on the backs of the downturn. But more importantly, from a secular perspective, trends around the growth in the industry, the importance of education globally, the rise of the middle class in emerging markets, the importance of the knowledge economy, growing on a daily basis, really has spurred a more secular growth in this space by the public and private sectors alike. And at the same time, this is a time in which the technological revolution that has really transformed so many other industries is beginning to touch the education space and having an impact on a material basis. While the sector, by and large, people have for the longest period of time felt like it was largely immune to technological disruption. Some of the things that you're seeing in other industries in the media and consumer spaces around internet and software, around mobile and social and big data, all of those are actually having an impact in the education space in ways that just simply wasn't happening 4 or 5 or 6 years ago. I think those things are driving the earlier stage investment dollars, which is then trickling down into other segments of the capital markets. And so to take a second example, just by way of our own activity as a barometer of the space, as I said, we seek to advise and finance education businesses around the world, and we've seen real growth around that globally as well. So over the course of the last just a couple of years, we've done close to 30 plus transactions, all in the $100 million up to several $1 billion range, in the education sector. And we see that activity growing as well. And this is companies of all kinds. These are K-12 to higher ed companies operating schools. These are software and internet businesses that serve the education vertical. These are services companies. These are content and publishing businesses. Really all across the education value chain, you can see activity. I think that's quite encouraging. The second sort of key thing is that within a framework of accountability, we really do think that the private sector activity in the education space should be encouraged and stimulated. And I say that recognizing that today the private sector contribution to broader global education spend is still quite small as a percentage, as we've talked about. But in meaningful ways already, companies are serving market gaps at scale where they're delivering a product or service at a lower cost or higher quality or both. And I think that you know, with the right encouragement, the right regulatory frameworks, with the right accountability, you know, seeking to encourage that, I think would serve all of us well. You know, in fact, the company that, you know, has organized this you know, this education and skills forum, GEMS, is a clear example of that. You know, a business that has grown remarkably over the course of the last, you know, decade or two, has delivered a really valuable product and service to its region. I think another interesting example, I see my friend Jay Kimmelman sitting in the audience. His company that he founded, called Bridge International Academies, based in Kenya and now moving into other countries as well, has really pioneered and scaled a business model around providing low-cost, affordable, but high-quality private schools for the bottom of the pyramid. And so in Kenya, you know, for the last few years, they've been growing, you know, frankly, astronomically, you know, providing schools at, on average, about $6 a month, which is actually lower than the cost to the government of providing a public, you know, education, you know, to those same children, you know, in the urban and rural areas of Kenya. And they've also proven the ability through, you know, very interesting sort of systemized, sort of technology-centric approach to being able to scale that model to now being able to open over 150 schools per year, which is a staggering number if you think about it. And today they're already serving, you know, 120,000 students through, you know, over 400 schools. So that type of model, which is serving a community which is, frankly, you know, has access issues, certainly has quality, you know, oriented issues, but doing it through private sector funding, right? This is a company that's backed by the private sector, by some Silicon Valley investors, in fact, and others, and then is serving the private markets directly, taking tuition dollars directly from parents and operating outside of the public school system. I think is providing a valuable service. And I think there are many other examples like that. And then the third comment I'd make around this is that there are many different ways for the private sector to be involved in education. And I would encourage all of us to think creatively and ambitiously about how private sector organizations, institutions, and capital can be brought into to promote, you know, educational needs and objectives. So the social impact bonds that, you know, we've talked about earlier, that Goldman Sachs has been privileged to be involved in. We did the first one in the U.S. That was back in 2012, and I've done that in Utah, in New York, Massachusetts, and most recently in Chicago, both around providing youth services to you know, to combat you know, recidivism, as well as you know, early childhood education services. We can go into it in a little bit more detail because the structures are complex, but I think very interesting and innovative. At the same time, you know, when I look across the spectrum, there are many other ways in which the private sector can collaborate with nonprofit and public sector organizations. A couple of years ago, we had the privilege of introducing at our own education conference in the United States, one of the leading teacher unions in the United States with a private British company, which, and they collaborated eventually, creating a joint venture to create a online platform for the sharing of free digital resources to enable teachers to access high-quality digital materials in a scalable way. And it's sort of an odd combination if you think about it, an American you know, teacher union working with a you know, private sector you know, for-profit company based in the UK. You know, but that's a partnership that has really grown, has taken off, has benefited hundreds of thousands of people, you know, teachers in the United States and their students reaching into the millions. Similarly, a company that we had the privilege of working with called 2U, last year we helped them to raise you know, $130 million in their initial public offering, is a business that partners with nonprofit universities and helps them take their degree programs and put them online. And it provides a complete service from the online platform and the software that enables the solution, to the marketing and recruiting, to the technological infrastructure and back-end support that enable a nonprofit university that might not otherwise have the resources and capital to spend several $1 million or tens of $1 million building an online presence, to be able to do so, to be able to scale their operations, to be able to extend their brands into geographies that they otherwise weren't able to previously, and to be able to enroll students that might otherwise not have access to the education offered by those institutions. I think there are a variety of other examples that we can touch on, but let me just pause there and turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much for these encouraging examples. And perhaps the next panelist, Ms. Julie Mercer, Partner Education Lead, Deloitte, United Kingdom. Do you also have some good news for us?
Just a little bit about what Deloitte does in this space and why we're sitting on this platform as well. So we don't lend money, we don't raise money, but what we do is play a very important role, I think, between the public and the private sector, brokering relationships, supporting successful design, delivery, and rollout of projects and programs. And I guess what my starting position is that actually government has an unenviable task of meeting the demand of an increasingly demanding global community who want greater and greater outcomes from their education system, have higher expectations than ever before, and I think those expectations will continue to rise as we move into the second half of this century. And if we don't solve this problem, that's quite frightening for everyone. My other point would be that we all talk about funding and how to fund education, but I think that's only one half of the equation. I think nobody really looks properly at what it costs and the productivity that we get from the education system we have. So I think alongside thinking about how we're going to pay for all of the support and the education systems that we need to build and evolve and improve across the globe, we really need to think about what it's costing and how we can get better value for money from every dollar that we invest, whether that's from the government or whether it's from social investors or whether it's from commercial private sector organizations. I would agree with a lot of what the panel has already said in terms of the way in which the role of the private sector has changed in delivering right across the education supply chain. So I've been doing this job for about 12 years, and for about the first 8 of those, I'd never had a phone call from a bank or a private equity house wanting to know about the world of education. And in the last 4 years, I've probably had more conversations than anyone could imagine. And what's been quite interesting is as the private sector has looked at the opportunity right across the globe in education, it's been a bit like, probably not the pool outside, because you'd probably just jump in, it looks nice and warm and inviting, but they've kind of been treating it a bit of a pool, dipping their toe in, seeing whether it would work, what should they do, how do they do it, and really needing to understand how can we contribute to supporting the financing and the funding of education, but always also thinking about what am I going to get back in return. And when I say that, I don't mean return on their investment in cash terms, but as we've already heard, many investors are looking for social return as well as economic return. I thought the conversation that we had this morning from Andreas was really insightful, and what it showed us was that spending priorities and how you spend the money has different impacts on the outcomes you receive, and actually we're leaving money on the table by not pushing our systems to drive better outcomes, deliver better economic value, and get more people into jobs and create more value in the world of work later. So, I mean, I think he suggested at one point that if we could get everybody up to the sort of current average, we could pay for the education system today. But we've done some work in the UK. The UK government have a national pupil database, which holds probably more data points and information than any other student information system anywhere in the globe. And we were very privileged a couple of years ago to be given an opportunity to play with that data. And we mashed it with lots of other publicly available data to see what it told us. And it gave us 3 insights, which I think are very interesting and I think inform the debate and the conversation. Andreas touched on one of them this morning. When we looked at what schools spent and the outcomes they received, it was just a big black blob on a graph. There was no correlation between what the pupils spend and the outcomes that schools were achieving. So some schools getting very little money were getting great results. Other schools who were getting lots of money were getting very poor results. When you then go on to ask what's happening in that school or that school that makes a difference, that evidence base isn't well understood and it's not well shared. The second observation was what we tried to do was understand why some children do well in schools and why some children do less well. So we took this data, and not me, because I'm not an economist, but we got some very clever mathematicians and econometric modelers to strip out various bits of data and do some analysis on this. And what we found, if you took the average performance of the average child in a UK secondary school at Key Stage 3, and then you looked at what that performance was for a kid who was on free school meals. So in the UK, we give free school meals to children in certain sort of income brackets. That dropped. If they lived in a socially deprived part of the country, based on its Edaki score, that dropped again. And if they were a certain ethnicity, in the case in the UK, it was Romani Gypsies, that dropped further. If you put that child into a high-performing school, an outstanding school as rated by Ofsted, their performance went up. If you encourage them, the year we did it, Michael Gove had just introduced the EBAC. Nobody had time to prepare for it, so we used the EBAC as a sort of a way of thinking about academically rigorous subjects. So if you studied the EBAC in that outstanding school, you more or less recovered the disadvantage of where you came from. So that says to me that schools have got a huge opportunity to drive performance, much more than I think sometimes we give ourselves credit for. And I guess the third point that came out of that was the point that I made a few minutes ago, that we really don't try to understand why these things are different in different schools, what a particular teacher does in a particular classroom with a particular group of children that makes such a difference to their futures than in many others. The other comment I'd like to make is, and again, I'm coming from a sort of a UK Western, probably UK US perspective here. You know, when you talk about the role of the private sector in education, often that's seen with great skepticism, very cynically, and often people challenge you as to whether or not there's a role for the private sector in education, who should be making profit out of schools and our young children. I have a challenge back. I think that the only people who don't make a profit out of school education, and indeed any education, is the governing body of the school or the institution that you're looking at. The teachers, the temporary teachers, the technology, the qualifications, the textbooks, the infrastructure is all provided by private sector organisations. And I think sometimes we forget that there's a huge investment already in education, out with some of the innovations that we've been talking about so far. We've been, I guess one of the big questions was, well, how else can the private sector get involved? I think social impact bonds are an exciting development. I think they've really been used in sort of the periphery of education, but those trials and those tests around early years, around welfare to work, which we ourselves have been heavily involved in the UK, are starting to prove models. The big challenge I have is how you create sustainability, so when the funding goes away, when the impact bond is ended, the outcomes remain and they stay. And then I think the final thing that I'd want to say really is I think that if we're going to encourage more involvement in the supply chain from the private sector, we need to create a level playing field. I've done quite a lot of work in the UK with the higher education system, where on one level government is trying to encourage private providers to come into the higher education sector, and on another level they make it really hard to actually set up as a university. There are different rules about the regulatory landscape within which they operate, and you know, they're treated very, very differently. We did some work last year looking at corporate failure in the education sector, and the conclusion that we came to was the corporate construct is less important than the goals, the ambition and the leadership within the type of organisation that's delivering the service. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much for pointing out a series of very, very important points. We may come back to at least some of them a little bit later. We now come to our government representative, Your Excellency, Professor Mohammad Thneibat, who is the Minister of Education in Jordan. And obviously, the governments have a very special role, I think, in most countries. They are the ones that provide public education and pays most of the bill. It's a challenge in most countries, both to expand the system and to improve the quality, which are both quite costly. And then, of course, in Jordan, you also have a significant size of refugees, which adds to the cost and to the challenge of the education system. So, Mr. Minister, can you deliver in the future for the new Sustainable Development Goals?
Okay, thank you very much. And I have a different story than what we have heard up to now. You have talked about a very stable environment and an advanced educational systems in all places that you have talked about. But in developing countries, the case is very different, as a matter of fact, because you have a lot of problems there. First of all, you are talking about unstable countries in most of the areas. And in some other areas, you are talking about educational systems in countries that witnesses a civil war inside the country. And in some other cases, like Jordan, you are talking about a small country with very limited resources that open the doors for its neighbor to come to Jordan because of the political unrest in the other countries in our neighbors. And we have a lot of people who came from Syria, who came from Iraq, who came from Yemen even, who came from Libya. And we started to witness some cases in Jordan that we did not see before, 5 or 6 years ago. When you go to some of our classrooms, you might find 80 students in a classroom. And you might find some students without textbooks. And you might find some classes without teachers, because we received 130,000 Syrian students from the Syrian influx to Jordan. Just to give you some figure about the situation there. In Jordan, we have 1.5 million Syrians, just Syrians. 36 of this number are in a school age. And we cannot deny any child in Jordan, regardless of his nationality, his religion, his ethnic background, of enrolling in our public schools. Private schools in Jordan is still not that strong to receive such kind of groups. Now, the government of Jordan set a plan, a national resilience plan, and a national response plan for the Syrian crisis only. And the cost of that plan for 3 years is $2,837 million. For education only, $681 million US dollars. For this year only, 2015, we have to have 256 million just to solve the problem of the Syrian children. Now, looking for this situation in Jordan, we see to the international organization and to donors that Jordan is bearing a humanitarian issue and should not stand alone tackling this issue. And when we are asking for help or presenting our case for international community, we are not asking for charity. We are asking international organizations and donors to take their responsibilities in this kind of issue. I have heard an excellent points that represent the case in San Francisco, Washington, and some other areas, and in Britain and in other areas. And I was just thinking about the huge amount of money you are talking about, while you have some countries suffering in educational era. So I said to myself, we talk globally, but unfortunately, we behave regionally and country by country. And in this situation, we cannot solve any problem. It is needless to say that education is the keystone for national development. And also, if you are looking for success, prosperity, security, you have to look for a solid educational system. And we heard some speech this morning at the auditorium there. You have to give a high and top priority for education. And education needs creativity, excellency, active partnership between public and private sector. But do we have the case? Do we have these requirements in most of the developing countries and in the Arab areas in general? Now let me just raise some questions if you allow me for that. The problem is not mobilizing the money sometimes. The problem is the efficient use of the money if you have the money. And here I want to ask a question. Are the taxpayer ready to pay more in countries like Jordan, which we have 5% of our GNP go for education, and 14% of our public budget go for education? And we need 450 schools just to host the Syrian students for the coming 5 years. And we don't know where and when the exit will be from the tunnel that the area entered that. So the cost of these schools, $600 million. And I can assure you that my country cannot do this job and have no money to pay just to host other students from other community. The second question, can the private sector play an essential role in financing education while they are profit-seeking organizations and companies? This is a big question that has to be raised when we are talking about the 3 Ps: private, public, partnership. But theory, good. And practicality, you have to stop and watch and think deeply about that. Another question. Do we have local donors, as you do have in Western countries, who can participate effectively in mobilizing money for education? I think unless the international community stand seriously and help countries such Jordan, who is playing a very humanitarian role, some of our countries and my country too will suffer from the shortage of the money that we need to host some other Arabs who are coming to Jordan because of the stability and security and peace that we have in Jordan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, Mr. Minister. Now, you asked some very important questions, and I think we would like to answer some of them, try. And we also would like to open up for the floor to contribute. But first of all, and I would like also to hear some feedback from private sector. But let's start with you, Norman, from the donor point of view. Now, what is clear, I think we all agree that we need more money, but we need to demonstrate that the money can be used in such a way that we have good results. And if you don't manage that, then certainly private sector is not going to invest. But it's just as bad with public funding, because public funding is depending on citizens who pay taxes and contribute. They want to see the results as well. So that is a challenge to make sure that we can better deliver on good quality education. But public-private partnerships and obviously private sector that can play different roles, sometimes for profit, sometimes through investments or contributions. From a donor point of view, how do you see this possible better cooperation between government, donor, private sector?
I think it's very important. Quite often it's difficult. I mentioned before that we have two sides to the EDB, one that works through government, one that is a private sector. It's like a bank and investment company. When you're dealing on the public sector side, you have to work with the government to get the policies and programs implemented that you are advocating. Quite often there is a reluctance to use the private sector. I mean, if you look at, we had a study done 2010, I think it was, that showed that about 39% of our education projects over the 2000 to 2009 period involved some facet of private education, which seems quite high, but in fact, the bulk of those were fairly minimal things. They didn't involve very sophisticated private sector initiatives. They involved things like capacity building and that sort of thing. So there still is not a lot of private sector being introduced through the public sector side of donors. But we are making progress. I mentioned this loan in the Philippines that was just approved in December. One of the components of that loan is a voucher program. What the government has done, they had a 10-year basic education system. They've added 2 more years of senior high school. We are supporting that. The total cost, $4.4 billion. We're paying $300 million. We're lending them $300 million. But a big part of that program is the introduction of a voucher scheme, an education voucher scheme. So in June 2016, 1 million students are going to turn up coming out of grade 10. Until in previous years, they would have gone into university. Now they will go into grade 11, then they will go into grade 12, then they will go into university or into the labor force. So the government's got to find a way of housing and teaching 1 million people in the first year and then another million in the second year. So what they've done is, as I said, 2 ways of doing this. We can do all government, we can build government schools, hire teachers, etc. But what they have instead done, and what we have worked for some time with them, including with GEMS, is to develop a voucher program for students graduating from public junior high schools and from private junior high schools, but who were subsidized under an existing education service contracting scheme that subsidizes relatively poor students at the junior high school level. So those 2 groups of students can avail themselves of a voucher, which is being set at about the level of the unit cost for public education delivery. So this is not trying to save money. This is saying on average it costs about 18,000 pesos, which is say $450 US a year, to teach a senior high school kid. You can take this voucher, you can go to a private senior high school or a public senior high school. If you go to the public, obviously you don't get the voucher. If you go to the private, you do get a voucher. And you can use that to offset all or part of your tuition. We expect about 400,000 students per year, so 800,000 students at any one time should be in the program. Part of our loan, I mentioned it was results-based, we actually have about 110 million of that $300 million loan tied to the government achieving its targets for students in private schools. So in 2016, they have to have 25% 2018, it's, or 2017, it's 30%. Then it goes up to 35%. If they don't achieve those targets, they don't get the money that they borrowed, and they'll have their Department of Finance chasing after them. So we've built into that incentives. And overall, with the students under the voucher program, which in fact we expect to be about 40% of all senior high school students, plus those private school students who are paying their own way, we expect around 50 to 55% of the senior high school students to be in non-government schools. So, I mean, it's one way where the government can use the private sector to deliver. It continues to be government financing. And I think this is the important part, because if you're to say we're going to just ramp up private education, your concern, of course, quite rightly, is that it's going to be inequitable, because who can afford to, how many students in the Philippines who are from relatively poor parts of the Philippines, how many can afford to go to private senior high schools? Not that many. And the other, I think, good thing about this, it will be regionally targeted in the sense that because it costs less to go to school in the provincial areas, the subsidy will be lower. In Metro Manila, the subsidy will be higher. And interestingly, the subsidy around that we envisage for Metro Manila, which is around 22,000 is pesos per year, is about where the Ayala Pearson, these new schools that have just been created, Ayala Pearson APEC schools, their price point is around 22,000 pesos for their existing APEC centers. Their senior high schools might be more than that. So we're not far off with the subsidy level. And you look at this average subsidy level of, say, 18,000, compared to this education service contracting scheme that operates now at the junior high school level, where they pay 6,500 or 10,500. So it's much more viable. It applies to everybody coming through. It's choice-based. And what we just have to make sure, and what we're working with the government on, is that although we're opening up the demand side with this, we need to make sure the supply side is opened up as well. And there are some constraints in there about how you establish. They were mentioned earlier. I think, Julie, you mentioned, what do you need to meet to establish school? Do you really need your own building? Do you really need that playing field? Because these can have a significant impact on costs. And you want to find a business model that will suit the environment. You can't expect a quote-unquote Harvard, level facilities when, particularly in the countries that we work in, whether it be in Bangladesh, in Vietnam, and in Manila, there's not a lot of space downtown, so you don't expect to see too many playing fields in the middle of Makati. So that's the kind of thing that can be done by being innovative and working very closely with the government to design something, which, okay, we don't know yet whether it's we've done the right design, because it doesn't come in the next little while, but at least we've done the work up front. The other thing, because of this results-based program, it's not a typical ADB project that ends after 5 years, for example. With those, the problem is always the sustainability of a program. You build in a new voucher which runs, which I'm doing, for example, in a project in Lao PDR. But what happens after 5 years? Does the thing just end? This is already built, this voucher program is already built into the medium-term expenditure plan for the government. They will completely finance it. So it is sustainable. So I think that's one way.
Thank you very much. We would like to open the floor also for some questions, but Rebecca, you would like to add, please?
Yes, sure. I thought it would be important to return to the question that the minister put on the table, that actually, Julie, you alluded to, which is there's a lot of discomfort, anxiety, nervousness within the education community on the role of the private sector in education. And I mean, I would actually be really interested, Victor and Julie, to hear your perspectives on how you are dealing with that. If you think it's an issue. We had recently at the Brookings Institution a symposium with a lot of private sector actors, policymakers, ministers, academics, teacher unions, the whole lot, on this question of the role of non-state actors in education. And I just wanted to share a couple thoughts or takeaways from that, and happy to share, of course, the materials if people are interested. But one is that it's very complicated, private sector engagement in education. And there's all sorts of different mechanisms. And we were looking particularly at developing world, poor countries, low-income countries, middle-income countries. And the terminology that the different constituencies use, the private sector uses, the ministers use, the teachers unions use, they use the same words to mean completely different things. So I think we do need an effort to sort of parse out our terminology. What are we talking about? Are we talking about, on a couple of lines, are we talking about a government system that actually runs everything? There's many of those in the developing world, actually, sort of soup to nuts, and school is free for everybody. Are we talking about a government system where schools are free, but they partner with nonprofit, non-state actors? So a lot of people call those private sector. It's not what we mean here. Is there a government system that partners with nonprofit actors like NGO churches and businesses, corporations, but subsidizes? You were talking all about this. So fees are not paid. Or are we talking about, and you can just keep going on, or a government system where you do have fee paying? And it seemed to be that the big sticking point is not really who is delivering the services. It's more about the regulatory environment, which is highly developed in high-income countries, but not highly developed in low-income, middle-income countries, and the question about paying fees, and particularly at the basic education level. And you would have that is, to me, the real sticking point that I see in the education community. Should poor kids be paying fees to go to basic education? And certainly, if I were to channel my colleagues who work on this, who are economists, they would argue that economists are pretty in line with human rights activists by saying that, because basic education has such high social returns, so as a government invests in children's education, it makes society better in many ways, health, crime, that is where we should funnel government money, and perhaps at higher education levels, let the private sector run that, because higher education is really benefiting the individual much more than society.
Thank you very much. Quick response from one of the private sector, because I would like to have your input as well from Mr. Minister. Yeah. What can private sector offer for a country like Jordan in the situation they are in right now? Do you see a role for private sector, be it global or at country, regional level?
I see a role for both, and I agree absolutely, Rebecca. I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of who pays and how and where and when. And I think the sort of the maturity, if that's the right word, it's probably not, of the democracy, the social fabric of a country is a big determinant of how you make that work, and that has to be recognised. You can't just lift and drop what we do in the UK or in even in Dubai into another geography without thinking about it within the local context. So absolutely buy that. I guess an example maybe of a country which I think spans both high economic growth and huge development challenges is probably India. And one of the things the Indian government have done, of course, is introduced a 2% levy on company profits to invest into a number of things that they feel they need some real support around, and one of those is education. So, there you have a country who can tap into the big global brands like Deloitte, like Goldman's, like Tata, like others who are, based in and building huge revenues in those countries and servicing large parts of that population, but global populations as well, and taking 2% of their profits and being able to then channel that into community projects in the south of the country where people really do need basic education, I think is a great model actually, and one that could probably be replicated. I think the other role of the private sector is that there are lots of individuals in all of our countries who have worked very hard, who have found themselves in very privileged positions and are now thinking about, what do I do? How do I give something back? You know, Gates Foundation is probably the best example of that, but the crowdsourcing of the sort of the funds that high net worth individuals have and companies have, where they want to challenge and put something back, where they're not expecting a huge additional return, capital return on their investment, I think is another way of doing that. But in order to do it, I think I go back to regulation. I think one of the advantages of countries where the education system is less well developed is that they have got a bit more of a greenfield site around the regulatory landscape. So they've got a chance to do something a little bit different and not get tied up in the knots that we get tied up in the West. So I think that's a positive, actually. And I think that looking internationally and bringing expertise and ideas, not to impose what works in one geography into another, but to really understand why it works, how might it work, what could you take, what's the good practice, and what are the things you definitely don't want to bring into that country. I think that's a role that we can play as well.
If I may offer just a few thoughts.
Very quickly, because we have
yes,
to over, yes.
Sure. I think, Minister, what you ask is a very important question. I don't think there are any simplistic answers to it. I've heard people, address it as, look, this is just a question of tax status. It really should be irrelevant. But I think that's probably too simplistic. Having said that, I'd offer a few thoughts. The first is that I do think, within a framework of accountability, and that is really important, within a framework of accountability, there are numerous examples of private sector participants being able to do simply what the government cannot do, and filling gaps in the market, I think, in really important ways. In Brazil, for example, going back, many years, recognizing that higher education access structurally is an enormous challenge for that, that country. They set up a regulatory regime that encouraged, private sector participation, and now the majority of their higher education students are enrolled in private for-profit institutions, and that obviously has had a very strong contribution, to the growth of that country over time. Now, I think there are various other examples I think that are worth just briefly surveying. We did a financing recently for a company called SoFi, which is an intermediary, a marketplace that aggregates lenders and borrowers for student financing. Now, student financing in the U.S., there's an enormous piece of it that is really basically run by the government under a regulatory regime known as Title IV. And there's a mix of grants and loans that are subsidized by the government, et cetera. Well, through SoFi, borrowers can actually find financing packages that come at a lower interest rate, because this company is able to, through its technology and through the application of various sort of market metrics, are able to discern borrowers that have the least likely sort of default rates, et cetera, and ultimately enable those borrowers to borrow at a lower cost of capital than they otherwise would have been able to access through the government. And so you would think that a system like that, the lenders are private capital. This is purely a market-making mechanism and platform. The lenders in this platform earn a return they otherwise wouldn't return from an attractive asset class, and the borrowers access capital at a lower cost to have it sort of win-win situation. In other contexts, the 2U example, the company that I raised earlier, is a business that partners with nonprofit universities. Now, nonprofit universities have tried, in many cases, to do online education on their own. In a few select cases, they've actually been successful in scaling their programs. In many, many cases, vast majority, I would venture to say, have been much less successful than they otherwise would have wanted, largely because of a combination of inadequate capital, but frankly inadequate competencies. Right? Inadequate competencies from a marketing perspective, from a technology perspective, from an operational perspective, to be able to run online programs that really look like online businesses that are completely separate from, though they would like to integrate with, their on-campus enrollments. And so a for-profit company that has expertise in this space can come alongside and provide something that is very accretive to that nonprofit's mission and objective, and actually, frankly, bring a lot of revenues that nonprofit otherwise would not have seen. You know, so and then I would raise, I'd go back to the
Sorry, Victor, we have to
okay, let me pause.
choose. Okay. I hope, Mr. Minister, you are a bit encouraged by some of this, because I would like to take the few minutes we have left to see from the floor. Please present yourself and perhaps indicate who you would like to answer your questions. Yes, madam, please. Microphone is coming up.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My name is Winnie from Kenya. I work for Housing Finance Foundation. Housing Finance is actually a bank. It's one of the biggest banks in our region. Now, I've got a question and a comment. And the question is, especially to the private sector, because I come from the private sector. And we are funding education for, or skills for technical and vocational skills development. I haven't heard any of you mention that. And the danger is we might fund a lot of education to the university level and saturate that area as it is in our region right now and create more unemployment. Whereas the bottom of the pyramid has more people, they are not skilled, and they have no jobs, and there's nobody to finance them. So I'd like to hear some of the things that you do in that space of skills development. And finally, number two, Mr. Minister, on the PPP, I think Africa Development Bank and the World Bank in our country have done a wonderful job. Now they don't give governments money. They are now looking for a private partner. So partnership for you would be essential. Grab a private partner, they will give the money through them to you, and you do what you want. Thank you.
Fantastic. Perhaps there is a private partner here who want to grab that chance, and then we can find some real solutions. Perhaps we can have two more questions first. Yes, please.
My name is Rolando. I'm from the Philippines. I'm from the UN Youth Advocacy Group. The 2 points I'd like to raise are, the first is corruption and transparency, and the second one is bureaucracy. The first one is the corruption issue. When Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines, there were lots of funds to rebuild schools in local areas in the eastern part of the country. But then people were waiting for updates, and there was no progress on the ground because the government misused the funds. So the question is, how do we ensure that we consider corruption and transparency in funding for education? And while it is true that, you know, it's very critical for us to be transparent, like young person like me, for example, in the Philippines, we're doing a lot of education projects and we have funds from different organizations, but there's so much bureaucracy in terms of financing. So my next question is, how do we hit the button and balance between transparency and youth engagement? Because we have a lot of capacities of young people on the ground doing projects, but we're stuck with bureaucracy and financing. So those are some of the points that I'd like to raise. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps one more. Yes, gentlemen.
I'm Chris Outram from something called United World Schools, which I rather agree with Rebecca Winthrop that primary education, being able to read, write, and count is a right as opposed to something we should be charging children for. My question is, because we've been hearing a lot about very big programs, extremely big programs, and yet in the conference the word innovation is used quite frequently. And I'm just wondering whether the panel has a view about how do people get over the startup issues of innovation and actually get momentum and obviously funding when the initial response to large organizations is, fine, send us your 5 years of accounts. You have to ask for big amounts of money. Rebecca was saying that SIBs are mostly $10 million or whatever. How do you get over that hurdle? It's kind of tough, even though you can promise that you will ultimately touch hundreds of thousands, if not millions of children.
Thank you very much. Let's start with the skills, technical, vocational. I think that was directed to one of you. Who would like to have a go for that? We don't have time to go for both.
Okay. So When I talk education, I'm talking the whole remit of education as shorthand, and absolutely TVET is critical, I think, particularly in developing countries where actually infrastructure is still being built, and we need talented young people and adults who can, who are safe and who can confidently do the construction or provide the service or whatever it is that the vocational training is delivering. In the UK, what we've done over the last 5 or so years is reintroduced the concept of apprenticeships as being a great pathway from school into the world of work. And more than that, what the government has been doing as well is really focusing on the employer determining what skills and what capabilities, and working hand in hand with both private private providers and colleges to develop the curriculum that they need to make sure that those young people and those adults are fit for the workplace. So that also touches on the corruption point as well, in terms of involving the employers and government in making some decisions and choices about how things get done, and the way in which, and that's a co-invested initiative. So there is funding for apprenticeships, but there is an expectation that employers will also invest in the development of those young people as well.
And I might add that I've seen some very interesting private sector examples in places like China, bridging the gap between sort of higher education and the workforce, a really important gap that only people are starting to focus on more and more. So we can talk about it afterwards.
Thank you very much. So perhaps a little bit more on the corruption and bureaucracy, which are obviously two very, very tricky and challenging issues. Who would like to have a go on that one? Minister, please.
Okay, thank you very much. The problem of corruption, bureaucracy, and conspiracies. And in Jordan, as a matter of fact, I'm talking about Jordan, and I have a full study about the third world corruption practices as a professor of management and public finance at the University of Jordan. But when you go to Jordan, you don't find such examples that you mentioned from Philippines or another country. We have no problem if the private sector would like to come and join us in developing our education system and our helping. And help us in these issues that we are facing nowadays. And we welcome all international organizations to come and give money direct to the private sector, and then the private sector do some work at education sector, public education sector. But the experiences that we have in Jordan, as a matter of fact, tell us that large portion of the money that comes from international organization go for managing the project and some other expenses. And I have a study at my office that 60% to 65% of the money that comes from international organizations or donors go to company belongs to the country that they gave us the grant or something like that. So this is the problem. The money, you might have a good amount of money that come to your country, but the problem, where do we spend the money? This is the problem. And first point that I mentioned when I spoke in this session, I said mobilizing money and bringing money is important, but the most important issue is the efficiency of spending that money. Just to focus on the things that you mentioned. The apprenticeship experiences. You are talking about such issue in a solid private sector. But when you have a case like Jordan, that you have not that strong private sector and just starting and weak private sector, you cannot talk about this concept. As a matter of fact, I myself invited the industrial sector men to sit together and put a curriculum for vocational education. And we give them all the buildings that we have, just to come and share us with developing the vocational education and the skills of our students at those schools. None of them, they came to my office again, because they realized that they have to pay some money in order to participate. So we are talking about weak private sector. And you cannot compare Jordan with India. We have such experience in India 10 years ago, as a matter of fact, that we have 1% of the public sector, private sector profit goes to education. But what is the amount of 1%? Comparing to the profit that the private sector is. As a matter of fact, it's a very negligible amount of money. Doesn't help.
Thank you very much. Well, quick answer to what I think is the last question on innovation and startup. Perhaps, Rebecca, you want?
Sure, it was a very good point, and I see a big 0 at the clock at the back, so I think we're out of time. So in brief, I think what you brought up about sort of how do you get funding to more local groups, grassroots groups, particularly when funding, the big money is given in big tranches. This is a real gap. And it's hard for charitable organizations, it's hard for investors, because it's much easier. The transaction costs of a very small grant are the same for a big grant. So you need a lot more manpower, and it's more complicated on the investors and the charity groups. But it is essential and important, and particularly in areas like girls' education, where you need really grassroots groups who know the culture to try to do work. So I don't have an answer other to say it is a really big gap, and we need to work on it.
Thank you very, very much. Now, we are indeed out of time. It just remains for me to thank a lot all the panelists. I think that even if we didn't identify the funds, I think several good ideas were presented. And I think that if we have the same kind of exchange of good ideas and good communication among some of the key partners at country level, we will be halfway there. So I'm looking forward to continue working together with you all. And thank you very much to all the participants. Thank you.